Whew. Wow, that took a while. At least it's finally over. I'm seriously running out of black and white stock footage for my stupid voice to talk over. Where were we? Something with a less distinct, let's remember how garbage everything is vibe, I think.
Mr. Bond.
Oh yeah, James Bond.
Let's stop playing games. Who was that man in your room?
You're hurting me.
I thought that was the idea tonight.
Now, who was he?
I don't know what you're talking about.
I win. What do you say to that? It's a waste of good scotch.
I'm looking for Dr. Goodhead.
You just found her.
A woman?
I think my mouth is too big.
No, it's the right size. For me, that is.
Okay, but he did those things for a good reason.
But first, you must become Japanese.
Right. Anyway, Bond just wasted half the movie running around basically blind, and then got on the fabled Orient Express after his insanely problematic plan. Somehow worked out anyway. And we have scenes of the newlywed bliss between him and Tatiana.
Well, it's time.
We're in here. We're all our here.
Oh, be sure to establish traditional gender roles with this Russian woman you'll soon forget about.
Do as I say, will you?
Yes, James.
And we also get this amazing out-of-context Bond moment.
Liar.
I mean, it's not great. And I guess it's kind of bad in context too, but she's for sure excited about her life with this guy. Yeah. I think I must have skipped over the part where the movie tried to convince me that he cared about her in any way. I guess because this is an earlier Bond movie, it convinced audiences, because that's how you showed affection in the 60s. But look at Bond's track record. And I mean just in terms of Sean Connery movies. But nah, I'm sure he really loves her. I'm not sure why he's still keeping up the act at all, although I suspect he just wants more of what she's been dangling in front of him. And he's being dumb enough to try and wait it out, just like Karen Bay said he would.
My friend, she's got you dangling.
But what about Tatiana? Let's look at her for a second. Isn't her job still to give false information to the enemy?
I have selected you for a most important assignment. Its purpose is to give false information to the enemy.
But at this point, she knows that the Lecter is real. She's the one who was working on it, so it's not really giving any sort of false information to the enemy, and more like directly giving the enemy the means to decode your secret messages. I guess it's conceivable that she still thinks she's just following the plan, which was fully fleshed out as...
From now on, you will do anything he says.
But even she needs to be questioning the logic behind it all.
You are not here to ask questions.
Or the lack thereof. Regardless, they're spending some time together, but then, like clockwork, it turns out that Karen Bay was killed. I told you, anyone who sees through Bond's cool facade has got to go.
All I want is that Lecter. All? Are you sure that's all you want? Well.
There's actually a really sad note here about the actor playing Karen Bay. Pedro Armendáriz, I think, found out he had late-stage cancer during the filming of the movie, and was in a lot of pain throughout his time there. He had previously worked in the 1956 movie The Conqueror, starring John Wayne as Genghis Khan, believably, which I will forever pronounce as Genghis over Genghis, but that's just me. The Conqueror was filmed in Utah, while the US government was doing nuclear testing there. Over 40% of the film's cast and crew developed some form of cancer within 25 years of that movie. And I guess while we can't prove anything, we can kind of be sure. But it's all speculation in case any lawyers are listening.
Farewell, Pilgrim.
Armendáriz worked double time to make sure his scenes were finished for From Russia with Love, and his paycheck would go to his wife, before he ended up committing suicide. less than 2 years after his close friend Ernest Hemingway did the same thing, and likely for similar reasons. Pretty brutal, and his character actually was a lot of fun, a womanizer in his own right who helped Bond figure out that everywhere in the world isn't the same as London's ivory towers.
Be still.
But in the movie, after his friend's death, Bond still has a mission to do. Remember that this is way back in a simpler time, when Bond cared more about the missions than revenge and murder.
Put me down! Put me down! Oh, you want to get off? Mr. Bond! For England, James? No. For me.
So he still plans to get the girl and the decoding machine back home. To help him out, another agent was supposed to meet them along the way, but it's finally time for Spectre to spring their trap. Finally! Because the bad guy is a mirror image of Bond. Do you get it yet? Grant, aka Blonde Bond, kills the agent and takes his place, putting on a fake accent that rivals my own terrible accent.
What kept you? Oh, I'm so sorry. I only got M-Soir an hour ago. I busted every record getting here.
Ugh. Maybe not. For a movie nearly devoid of tension, these scenes are actually pretty great. The spy game pretty much negates any possibility of trust, and Sean Connery as Bond does a pretty good job of showing that uncertainty throughout the scenes with Grant, a guy he just met. True, Grant says most of the right things, but there's just something about him, and so the tension keeps building. The most telling moment is when Grant's low-class upbringing shows, and he pairs fish with red wine.
I'll have a bottle of the Blanc de Blanc.
Oui, monsieur. Make mine Chianti.
White Chianti, monsieur?
No, the red kind.
Much to Bond's, and I assume everyone watching's, distaste.
No, the red kind. No, the red kind. No, the red kind.
I'll have a bottle of the Blanc de Blanc.
Oui, monsieur.
Make mine Chianti.
White Chianti, monsieur?
Should have trusted your hatred of the working man there, Bond. Red wine and fish? What a serf, what a rube, what an absolute cretin. You'll kick yourself for that one soon. So when I said the tension is rising, this is one time where it actually works out since we as an audience know who Grant is, and Bond is still the unwitting puppet in Spectre's plan. But it seriously has to pay off soon. I can only watch an uncomfortable dinner for so long. Also, if you needed any indication that Bond doesn't really care about Tatiana too much, he noticed Grant spiking a drink and just lets it happen. Two guys carrying a drug woman into a train car. Nothing to see here. It's the 60s, baby. Grant plays it off like he did that so he and Bond could escape, and Bond seems to buy it, ready to leave her behind for Queen and country.
What are you after? The girl or the lector?
All right.
But it's not to be because the trap is sprung, and Bond is knocked out, pretty easily, by his counterpart, and all appears to be lost. Oh, if only he trusted his feelings on the fish and wine pairing. He's completely at Grant's mercy. But we can't forget the fatal flaw of our Bond villains. The incessant need to voice their complete and total superiority over Bond. And even if Grant is technically a henchman, he does follow suit here. He lets Bond sit up and proceeds to explain the entire plot to him. So much talking. A lot of this exposition is stuff we already knew, because this movie has absolutely no respect for our intelligence. It's just another recap. Grant's gonna kill Bond and Tatiana, frame Bond, steal Lecter, and plant a sex tape on the two of them. Now, the sex tape is something that wasn't completely explained to us beforehand. We saw people filming them, but we weren't 100% sure what it was. But the sex tape is supposed to act as an explanation for Bond's actions, ruining his reputation and exposing the British all at once. And if that's not bad enough, Grant's sociopathic tendencies that were mentioned once an hour ago finally come back into play. And he says he's gonna torture Bond?
My orders are to kill you and deliver the Lecter. How I do it's my business. It'll be slow and painful.
I'm not sure if this kind of thing is completely necessary in From Russia with Love, our fun spy thriller. Especially since this is what Grant wants to do, not Spectre. But it does cement him as kind of a bad guy. So all villains have at least one fatal flaw though. And Bond, for all his own flaws, sees that he might be able to exploit one of Grant's. Greed. After he stops beating himself up for not immediately shooting Grant in the face for ordering red wine with fish.
Red wine with fish. Well, that should have told me something.
His mind starts working on how to get out of this jam. Bond offers him money, which Grant scoffs at. Ha ha ha. I am above mere money, I serve a higher power. Well, at least he stands for something. Except when Bond offers him the gold that's hidden in the briefcase, he jumps at that, immediately undercutting the standards he set for himself 5 seconds earlier. The greed aspect is weird, since I'm not sure why he needs the extra money. He lives on a private island already. What's he gonna buy? Etiquette lessons? Learn to sip tea with his pinky out and which fork to use when?
Red wine with fish. Well, that should have told me something.
I don't know. But it's all part of the process to make him open the briefcase. The briefcase! Yes! I knew it would come back. See, everything ties back together. In this movie, they finally give Bond some real gadgets. I mean, finally, it's the second movie, but still. And he uses every single one. Admittedly, they all pretty much happen in a row at the end of the movie, but you gotta respect the hustle here. Remember way back in part 2 when I called it Chekhov's talcum powder? There's also mention of what I like to call Chekhov's talcum powder.
An ordinary tin of talcum powder.
But we'll come back to that later. In case you didn't know, like I didn't, talcum powder was and still is used to absorb moisture, often in baby powder. My amazingly well thought out reference for Bond's talcum powder is a reference to Chekhov's gun, a literary concept that says not to include useless stuff in your project, and if you do include it, make sure that there's an overall payoff. So, let's say you show something, like a gun sitting over a fireplace or something. That's a promise to the audience that it's going to be relevant later on. Like when a character needs to defend himself and the gun is still there. Now, that doesn't mean that every single object in every single scene needs to have some sort of big point later on. That would make things way too obvious, and needing to use every teacup or shoe or whatever is a bit much. But basically, if there's a setup, then there should be a payoff. So I thought I had it down pat, but the more I read up on it, it makes it seem like Chekhov's gun is actually a term that's used when the payoff doesn't happen at all. Like if they show the gun, but then the character never ends up using it, that's an example of Chekhov's gun. So in this movie, if they describe the briefcase in all its detail and then didn't use any of the gadgets in the end, then it would be an example of Chekhov's gun. The gun is what's missing, not what's used. So overall, the talcum powder in the briefcase can be seen as more of a foreshadowing thing than a Chekhov's gun thing. They're not breaking the mold with the Bond movies in terms of undermining literary concepts on screen.
No, it's the right size. For me, that is.
To be or not to be? That is the question.
I thought Christmas only comes once a year.
Whether or not they should have made an effort to be that groundbreaking is another argument entirely, especially since the writers were probably less concerned than I am with excessive nitpicking.
No, the red kind.
So the talcum powder, when placed correctly, is actually a tear gas canister, and Bond gets Grant to open the second briefcase in the worst possible way to set off the talcum powder tear gas trap thing. He actually checked to be sure that it was there when he rifled through Grant's case earlier, which is a great detail, legitimately smart, and they don't throw it in front of your face like the rest of the movie's plot.
Excuse me.
You did say your clock was correct.
Russian clocks are always correct.
So even though prolonged use of talcum powder could have given them cancer anyway, they choose to fight it out instead. It's a tough fight to film in close quarters, but it's pretty well done. They go back and forth, and the camera work is solid. If only Bond had used his light slap on the back technique to knock him out. But we're finally due for some actual punches. Bond eventually wins because, of course he does. But when it comes to henchman fights, this one is up there. It's pretty visceral, and not that the Bond movies ever really steer clear of violence, but I think this one stands up pretty well. And since by this point we know that Grant was responsible for a lot of murders, Ali Karambay included, though off camera, we are elated that he's finally done. For all the crap that I give him though, Donald Red Grant is one of the best adversaries to face off against our hero, since the mirror qualities are probably meant to show that Bond could have easily ended up fighting on the other side. Pretty much doing the exact same stuff except for better pay and a private island getaway. Because they're mirror images of each other. But it's all over now, no time to dwell on it. I find that these movies work out a lot better if you don't dwell on it too much. Bond grabs all the things in the train cart that are important to him. The Lecter, the blackmail stuff, his hat, and he's off.
Wake up.
Okay, fine, he'll take Tatiana too, I guess. And now he's off. Wow, that was a pretty thrilling conclusion, but I'm glad we got there. Even though I spent a good amount of time nitpicking it to death, From Russia with Love does deserve its accolades and stands as one of the best Bond movies, in my humble opinion. I really enjoyed it a lot. Definitely a step up in quality, and I'd give it... What do you mean it's not over? 15 minutes left? For what? A helicopter chase and a boat chase? Doesn't that seem kind of pointless though after we already watched him do the fight? Okay, whatever. No, it's fine. I'll play it off. I don't know. So you thought it was over? Oh hell no, you thought that was it? Don't be a fool. No one could possibly think that it was done yet. I guess they figured the movie needed to end on a couple major action scenes, but these ones, despite being well shot and all that, do seem kind of anticlimactic after the major confrontation is already over. But it does help to kind of create the myth of Bond as an action star instead of just a spy. Usually though, the big action scenes are a way to heighten the tension in a lead up to the grand climatic confrontation with the bad guy. They don't usually happen after the fight is already done, when I'm completely spent. In the overall movie though, the action is certainly ramped up, at least compared to Dr. No, but I don't think the sequences necessarily add anything to the plot. At the same time, what do I know?
Keep your hands up, Mr. Bond. We're sending a boat along to take you off.
Employee of the month, ladies and gentlemen.
We're just gonna jump past that though. We're gonna go to the very end because this plot just keeps trucking along to Inspector is trying to determine fault for their failure. Now, there are two possible fall guys here, Klebb or Kronstein. Kronstein's plan went off without a hitch for most of the movie. He understood that the Brits would get involved even though they pretty much knew it would be a trap, and played both sides against each other pretty brilliantly. Chess equals smart tactician. So people who play chess are just better than the rest of us, which is what the movie is trying to say. At the same time, Klebb's job, her only job actually, was to choose the personnel that would be involved in the mission. And that's really just Tatiana and Grant, both of whom have completely failed in their primary objectives. And so looking at that, with stacking up all the evidence, whose fault does it come down to? Grant's arrogance and greed were completely overlooked by Klebb, and he followed the Dr. No school of thought and revealed the entire plan to Bond, and then let Bond kill him and then escape. He just let himself die. So when Kronstein protests that it was a personnel issue,
It was Kleb's choice. Her people failed.
yeah, it was. We're on his side. Since as an audience, we've seen everything play out, we know it was a total failure in terms of personnel.
Who is Bond compared with Kronstein?
Exactly.
But I guess with all this talking, you can kind of see where this is heading. Blofeld has Kronstein killed by a guy with a knife boot for doing his job right. Sure, okay. Really inspiring loyalty with those kinds of decisions. These are the self-proclaimed world's best criminal minds, right?
Correction. Criminal brains.
I mean, I guess you can self-proclaim anything at all.
I have anticipated every possible variation of counter-move.
Huh. I guess it doesn't work for everybody. Small cut-in with a little bit of movie trivia here. In this movie, Blofeld was played by Anthony Dawson, and you might remember him as the rock-obsessed henchman Dent from Dr. No.
Mr. Smith & Wesson. And you've had your 6.
Although the voice is obviously done by somebody else.
Poor old Strangways. Bit of a bug of his, you know, this amateur geology.
12 seconds. One day we must invent a faster working venom.
I wonder how tough it is to get a gig as hands and back of head in Hollywood. If any casting directors are watching, I have both of those things, so hit me up. But Dawson is the first of 7 actors to play the role of Blofeld in the Bond movies, all the way up to No Time to Die at least. But back to the movie. So our sprightly villainess Kleb has survived despite her incompetence, and her new job is now to get the Lecter back or else, and apparently she does not have the same planning abilities as a chess grandmaster. All the carefully laid out schemes are thrown aside for a more direct approach, and she does what any self-respecting woman in a position of authority would do. Puts a wig on, pretends to be a maid, and tries to kick Bond to death with her knife boot.
Knife. Boot. Knife. Boot. Knife. Boot. Knife boot.
Patent pending. Bond is apparently aware of the product though, and shows up one of the logistical shortcomings of the knife boot by using a chair in yet another fight scene, albeit slightly less interesting than the last one, and not helped along by all of her grunting. So Kleb's plan is doomed to failure from the start, because of course it is. Bond won't be defeated by some old lady. He almost is, but Tatiana's love for a guy she met 3 days ago is not a ruse at all, I guess. And that love is apparently more important than her mission and her country. Let's take a look at this though, because at this point, wouldn't Tatiana still think that she was acting as a spy for Russia?
You are not here to ask questions.
She never received orders otherwise, as far as we know. So she should still be under the impression that she was working for Kleb. Kleb certainly thinks so.
Take this.
When Grant did his exposition dump, she was out cold in the other room. And sure, Bond could have told her about Grant fully explaining the plot, but why should she believe a word that Bond has to say? There's no reason for her to be trusting him in any way at this point. But she decides to shoot her boss anyway because the movie needs to end at some point, I guess.
I'll have what she's having.
Why no, I couldn't afford the Seinfeld copyright. Why do you ask?
You are not here to ask questions.
Also, she loves him?
I know I love you, James. I love you.
Just tell me.
I love you, it's true.
I mean, she said it earlier, right after this happened.
Liar.
Way back at the beginning of the movie, she said she could act as someone's lover if...
Perhaps if he was kind and kulturny.
Sure, Russian ideas of kindness might be different than my own, and my understanding might be skewed because of my Western bias. But I don't remember too much kindness in this entire movie. Besides buying her some clothes on the company credit card, what else has he really done? There was that time...
Now that we've been properly introduced.
Careful. Ganz upset me.
Not really. Or maybe...
Come on, I'll leave you here.
No. You can see an example of her level of commitment during the dinner scene.
I have the grilled sole. And for madam. What about you, Nash?
Yes, it sounds very nice. Make that 3 of those, will you?
The whole time I thought she was still playing her part, but apparently somewhere between seducing him in a hotel room and being drugged on a train, love has blossomed. Daniela Bianchi gets a lot of praise for her role, but I never really found it to be too interesting. Not really a far step above Honey Rider in terms of being pulled along behind as he runs from one plot line to the next.
Take some cover. Come on. Come on, never mind.
Sure, she was capable, I guess, but in the end she's just another blank slate pretty Bond girl for most of the movie, except if we return to this moment here, when Bond is at his lowest point, about to be kicked in the shin by an old lady. She takes control and makes an actual decision, taking out Kleb, probably for the inappropriate touching from before.
Corporal, I have selected you for a most important assignment.
While it may be a groundbreaking moment for Bond girls in terms of involvement in the plot, this really drives home the point that it was really a personnel issue in the end, wasn't it?
It was Kleb's choice. Her people failed.
It was your plan. They followed it implicitly. They followed it implicitly. Implicitly. They followed it implicitly. Implicitly. Implicitly.
Kleb had to choose 2 people to be involved, and she made 2 very poor choices. Spectre is really starting to look like a bunch of idiots. Their starting roster is really thinning out too, all at the hands of this Bond guy. Oh whatever, it doesn't matter. James Bond will return and all that. But if you remember, I mentioned that the book version had much more of a cliffhanger ending, where Bond still won, but was stabbed by the poisoned knife boot and blacked out as the novel ended, leaving the reader unsure of his fate. Ian Fleming really did consider going the Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes route, letting his character die off, but he couldn't do it. Conan Doyle may have brought Holmes back due to public outcry, but I feel that Fleming was more concerned about the potential lack of income. But this is a movie, and we need a bit more certainty here. Bond survives virtually unscathed, as he always does, and he gets the girl, as he always does, deciding to end the movie by tossing the blackmail sex tape into a Venetian canal. And here I thought he would add to his personal collection.
Damn, I look good.
It sound right, boy.
Now, to the layman, it might seem like I rushed through the end of the movie, skipping over the intricate details that are necessary thematically and structurally. But any amount of rushing I'm guilty of had absolutely nothing on the end of the Cold War. Okay, that's not entirely true, because historical precedents exist. But that sounded foreboding, and I'm glad I could bring it back. I almost forgot what I was supposed to be talking about. But yeah, the Cold War. One year it's still going strong, seems like it's gonna outlast all of us, and the next it's just falling apart. You really can't find good Cold Wars these days. Seriously though, the end really seemed to sneak up on people, meaning that even though the rumblings were there for years, mostly starting on the economic front, most people were probably convinced that they were in it for the long haul.
Beg your pardon, forgot to knock.
Especially the guys who had been fighting this type of ideological warfare for years. These guys were the old guard, the ones that we sometimes call cold warriors, the guys who really got off in all the escalating tension. But it was all coming to an end, and to see the end, we need to look closer into the Soviet Union. Basically, the situation there was getting worse and worse, economically, politically, infrastructure falling apart, literally. But the leaders didn't want to change things up. Listen, I understand that was vague, but you'd be surprised how often in history you can just write something was either political or economic, and just leave it at that. Old school communists have been running the Soviet Union for a long time, basically stocking up on weapons and maintaining a giant standing army, and they were completely petrified that any change might seem like a weakness, or worse, ruin the status quo. Eventually though, after 3 elderly leaders died in the span of 28 months, they brought in a younger guy with some crazy ideas on how it should all be run. Yes, a young man in his prime, a 54-year-old whippersnapper named Mikhail Gorbachev.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Yeah, that guy. Remember, even though the Soviet Union was technically its own nation, it was made up of Soviet republics that had their own governments, which for the most part did little more than implement the decisions taken by the Communist Party in Moscow. So in order to try and fix this failing nation, Gorbachev began to allow more freedom to those 15 republics, as well as the satellite states where they controlled things, but they weren't technically part of the USSR, places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Gorbachev brought a bit more of a thaw to the chilly Soviet sphere, introducing the concepts of glasnost, meaning openness and transparency, and perestroika, restructuring, to kind of modernize and invigorate the politics and economics of the Soviet Union, as well as re-energize its increasingly tired population. It was going to be great. Politically, they were going to talk openly about the past, blame them for everything, then come together under the shining banner of communism and move on. Move forward even. Economically, they were going to allow the private ownership of businesses, moving away from the total control held by the Soviet government, as well as introducing economic partnerships with the West. Gorbachev was a true believer though, and even though he wanted to reform, he still wanted all these separate entities to fall in line under the great banner of the Communist Party. His fatal error was that he thought that everyone else wanted to be under that great banner with him. Even at that time, it's hard to see how this could be considered anything but naive. But deep-set beliefs can make us act a bit off sometimes. In the end, inevitably it seemed, talking about the mistakes of the past led people to talking about the mistakes of the present. And talking about the mistakes of the present led to the individual republics taking back control from the overall Soviet Union. These republics were not used to any sort of decentralized freedom, so when Gorbachev opened the door a crack, they used the opportunity to kick it down. And on an individual level, the Soviet people finally seemed to be tired of being the have-nots. It could be that Gorbachev was just naive, but really it's not like the USSR had never talked about their past mistakes before. And even though I'm looking at the end of the Soviet Union here, there are always more historical precedents to talk about. Always. After Stalin's death in 1953, there were hopes that a less brutal Soviet Union was going to emerge. And the early years were actually called the thaw to indicate that there was going to be a lot less of all that nasty purging business, and that the icy Soviet heart was melting. The new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, gave a famous speech in 1956 that acknowledged the purges and the repression of the previous years for the first time publicly. But he laid it all pretty much at the feet of Stalin, which we can understand is not wholly true since there was no way that one person acting on their own could cause so much suffering. And even though it was meant to be a secret speech, as with most things that are meant to be hush-hush, it wasn't a secret for very long. Open criticism of the Soviet Union inside its borders was unheard of, and a surefire way to make sure the KGB kicked down your front door at their witching hour, about 4 a.m.
I'll be sorry to go.
This change in the status quo, from being able to say nothing at all to being able to actually talk about how most of your family disappeared at various points over the past 30 years, among other ideological views, led old-school communist hardliners to call out Khrushchev as revisionist against the classic Marxism-Leninism that had been the basis for the creation of the Soviet Union, as well as communist China. So Khrushchev's efforts, which included shifting to a more cohesive existence with the West, led to him losing support and being removed from power in 1964, being replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who was a fan of a more classic Soviet ruling style. And the period known as the stagnation began. The one positive note, I guess, is that Khrushchev did manage to avoid being shot in the head when he lost power.
Khrushchev considered the fact that he was exiled instead of executed to be one of his proudest achievements.
So that's something. The revisionism that I'm talking about was also one of the reasons that China and the Soviet Union split off from each other by the early 1960s. The Sino-Soviet split, as it's called, is worth an in-depth look, especially considering the respective leaders, Khrushchev and Mao, hated each other. This is a great story, One time, Mao forced Khrushchev to meet him while he was swimming, acutely aware that Khrushchev himself could not swim. Must have been a really great meeting, really productive. But aside from hilarious moments where world leaders act like petty children, my point is that the Sino-Soviet split also threw away the idea that communism was a sort of single entity, since both China and the Soviet Union continued to exist alongside one another for decades. Admittedly, I haven't talked about China at all, even though that's due to space and all that other stuff I keep complaining about. But I see you, China, I didn't forget about you. If we remember, China now is obviously a major world power, but it is still run by its Communist Party, the one that took power in 1949. Although the degree to which that party has changed, and the degree to which China is actually striving for communism as it was laid out way back in the 19th century, are up for debate, since considerations and basic realities have changed a lot since Marx and Engels published their work. I mean, in terms of changing definitions, and as I move this conversation back towards the end of the Cold War, just look how quickly Gorbachev moved the ideological goalposts from where they were initially to where they were when he came to power in 1985. A few years later, the country was gone.
Surprised?
What are you doing? What's wrong with you? Are you crazy?
So back to the breakdown of a superpower. The biggest change in this newer era from older efforts was that when Soviet republics started to try to exert some form of independence, thanks to Glasnost and Perestroika, Gorbachev didn't send in the Red Army to beat down the protesters every time they raised their heads like some kind of anti-freedom and anti-self-governance whack-a-mole. He was the first Soviet leader who was born after the 1917 revolution. Not long after, mind you, but still. And he just didn't get the way that they typically did things. These new freedoms led to a rise in nationalism and efforts to democratize within the Soviet republics and on an individual level, both being threats to overall Soviet unity and also being in direct conflict with communism and what it promised. But Gorbachev also had more pressing concerns. Listen, the Soviet Union was hemorrhaging money at this point, and they were scrambling, split internally between those who wanted to change and those who wanted to stay the same. Gorbachev's attempts at reforms were made to jumpstart the failing economy, but they were mostly half measures that were too little too late. The overall Soviet economy was grinding to a halt. Actually, maybe by that point it had already broken down, since the atmosphere it offered was not one of innovation and growth, but of just kind of being there. Existing. Think of a car engine. Sure, I don't know a thing about them, but I don't know a thing about the economy either, so the analogy works. So for engines, there are a bunch of problems that come up as time goes on. And while you might be able to fix them up one at a time and keep the car running for a few more years, at some point, you're just going to need a new engine. The Soviet Union did not subscribe to that theory. They were convinced that they could keep the same engine running forever, even though by the mid-1980s, it was held together with band-aids and gum. Gorbachev might have been a true believer in communism, and even though he wasn't blind to the actual issues that he faced, he was in trouble. He was stuck with this rising wave of debts that came from the insanely expensive and ongoing arms race with the West, which was eating up his budget, as well as other problems, like the Chernobyl disaster, which happened just over a year after he took office. As a result, he's forced to go around hat in hand, as the old folks say. Definitely not me, just the old folks. Asking for loans to keep the country going. That's not very superpower-y behavior, is it? So while Gorbachev was busy and his back was turned, the leaders of the Soviet republics, remember these 15 individual republics, used the overall climate and the greater freedoms that it allowed to start to push for their own independence. I'm not going to go into the day-by-day breakdown of the plans and the speeches and the ideas and the schemes that led to the end. Instead, I'm just going to end the Soviet Union's nearly 7-decade-long history in the next, slightly too long sentence. Seeing that the writing was on the wall, so to speak, and after a failed last-ditch coup attempt by the Soviet hardliners, Gorbachev gave up his position of General Secretary and signed away the country's existence at the end of 1991, signaling the end of the Soviet Union with the stroke of a pen. Kind of poetic, all this talk of pens and swords, considering all the blood that it had taken for the nation to get started way back when.
Their new world might look promising, but although the land had been taken away from the capitalists, the workers didn't get it.
Sure, maybe no one here mentioned a sword, but it's poetry, it doesn't have to make sense. I know I make it sound kind of streamlined, but by the end of 1991, all the republics had already backed out of the Soviet Union as a whole anyway. Gorbachev had given them an inch, but they had taken a mile. Once the republics had the democracy option, They didn't want to be involved in the overall Soviet Union anymore. At the same time, the hardliners' classic strategy of sticking our heads in the sand to avoid all of our problems wasn't a real solution either. I don't know, maybe the Soviet Union couldn't be saved. Probably not. But it might have limped along for a few more years if they had stuck to their tried and true methods of general repression. I'm not saying that was better. Definitely not. But clearly the reforms that Gorbachev initiated did not lead to Soviet prosperity or bring the nation together. A fun side note, even though Russia, as one of the 15 republics making up the Soviet Union, dominated the nation in terms of centralized control and in pretty much all aspects of life, the final country to declare independence from the USSR was not Russia, but our friends over in Kazakhstan. So for a few days, Kazakhstan was the sole nation involved in the then defunct Soviet Union. And as quickly as I went through all of this, the processes that allowed it to happen went back a few years, even if it ended up as a surprise to pretty much everyone involved. So the two superpowers duked it out, and now one side is left. So all should be well in the world, right? Wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong.
What's wrong?
You should know by now, every time I ask a leading question, it's always wrong. Hell, anyone with even a vague awareness of what's going on in the world today should recognize there's still not too much cohesion going on.
We have not had chance to peruse today's headlines. I rather like the last one. It isn't even mine.
That's proof, right? But, as opposed to what some may have hoped for, the end of the Cold War didn't lead to worldwide unity and nations falling in line behind the United States, who I just realized I haven't mentioned in this section yet. The United States government wasn't even sure that breaking up the Soviet Union was the best way to go when it was actually taking place, despite for the previous decades making every effort to undermine the Soviets, including, under Reagan, hitting them in their wallets by getting Saudi Arabia to lower its oil prices so the Soviets could barely compete, among other things. At the same time though, no one was sure what the ensuing fallout would bring. Fallout may be a poor choice of words, though it was likely to bring even more uncertainty to a region that was rife with it already. Still, there wasn't much the outside forces could do in terms of maintaining the status quo, even if they wanted to. No. Efforts to keep the Soviet Union together needed to come from inside, and based on the entirety of this video, that clearly didn't happen. So with the new independence of these Eastern European nations, the overall landscape may have changed, with capitalism as the now winning ideology.
We needed weenies. Mr. Brown had weenies. It's as simple as that.
But the end of the Cold War didn't magically end all these feelings of mistrust between the East and the West.
Beware the dove that goes boom.
Not to be outdone, the former Soviet republics set up the Commonwealth of Independent States, which looks really familiar to the Soviet Union in terms of landmass and membership.
This is the
Confederacy of Independent States.
Yes, that checks. And this here's the
Soviet Union.
That's the same.
But definitely has nothing to do with the Confederacy of Independent Systems from the amazing Star Wars prequels.
I don't like sand. It's cold, black and irritating. It gets out.
Ooh, he doesn't like the Star Wars prequels. How brave, what a stance. The increases in violence around the world that we saw in the years after the end of the Soviet Union might show that US officials were right to worry, but it's hard to deny the nations their independence, especially if that's kind of your thing? But we all need to move on at some point. Russia ended up as the successor to the Soviet Union in international affairs, since, like I said, it had dominated internal control throughout a lot of the USSR's existence anyway. By the end, most of the key presiding leaders were nationally Russian, and other republics were taking a back seat. So Russia taking over meant that the new Russian leader, Boris Yeltsin, got their nuke codes, and even took on Soviet debts, hoping for a smoother transition. But not everyone was happy. Ukraine wanted a portion of the seized Soviet assets and even took Russia to court over it. But I think it was pretty well understood that Russia was taking over. There wasn't much of a time when Moscow wasn't firmly in control. There's a reason that Sean Connery didn't star in From Ukraine with Love. Obviously there isn't an insane amount of detail included here, but I never claimed to be any sort of authority. And I think we can all agree that someone who makes a James Bond/history series has some other issues going on in their life. So the post-Cold War festivities can now begin, except that they couldn't because even though the former nations that made up the Soviet Union were now free to do their own thing, they had to deal with increases in poverty, crime, corruption, and all the fun things that existed in the Soviet Union but you couldn't openly talk about before. So now that it was all out there for everyone to see, now that they had their independence, what came next?
No matter what happens now, say and do nothing.
So in terms of legacy, Russian succession of the Soviet Union didn't equate them to superpower status, and they weren't brought into the international fold as its leaders must have hoped. You think that losing that title would have no effect at all on a population? If you're on top for a long time, it's hard to come to terms with the idea that you aren't anymore. Look at some of the sports greats that kept going after their best days were behind them. It's tough to sit on the sidelines after being the star. And who do people blame for this loss of prestige? Well, despite his efforts to save the Soviet Union, obviously that loss really affected Gorbachev's legacy, because he was there at the end. There are Russian polls that have him as the least popular leader of the 20th century. You know who tops that list as the best? Brezhnev, who's connected to prosperity, and Stalin, who's connected to victory. Not how you might expect, especially if you grew up in the West, and those two are more connected with repression and a general purging atmosphere. But since it's so hard to fall from the top, stability or even the illusion of power can matter more to individuals than pretty much anything else. Gorbachev gets no real love, at least in Russia. There's actually an interesting connection from what I was mentioning before. Remember when I was talking about Chekhov's talcum powder? Gun? Well, according to Gorbachev's interpreter, Pavel Palash, I think, Gorbachev himself was well aware of the concept, and part of his goal was working towards making sure that all of the nukes that we saw in the first act of the Cold War weren't used in the final one.
And he didn't want that.
So Gorbachev was a man of compromise and half measures, and that didn't work out with the people of the Soviet Union who were very much used to the opposite. He was not welcomed by the hardliners who liked the way it was, or the reformers who wanted to change everything, since he spent all his time trying to balance those two sides.
Sorry, not you,
Gorbachev.
Why not?
Sure, he tried to save the country, but still a lot of people only remember his failure to do so. Who said history was kind? And even though fears of the Cold War boogeyman, for both sides, may be gone, that doesn't mean that the same types of fears can't be played on for political gain. Yes, that means othering is alive and well, and so is the threat of a nuclear holocaust, even if it just seems less likely. Overall, the ideological dichotomy of capitalist versus communist that had dictated most of the foreign policy for the vast majority of the world for the past decades was broken, and made everyone reevaluate, well, everything. The United States, as powerful as they were, couldn't use their influence in every corner of the globe. And it was that Cold War dichotomy that kind of held the world in some sort of geopolitical flux for quite a while. When the Soviet Union broke down, everyone was free to run wild. And now, a word from our sponsor.
All across America, an amazing phenomenon is happening. With
knife boot.
Kids are getting dressed in a flash. Straps and zippers make
knife boot
easy to get into, and they come in all these flashy colors.
Knife boot by Spectre.
They not only go on in a flash, they go off in a flash.
Knife boot. Like DOS boot, but not a movie.
Is the world safer now than it was during the Cold War? It won't surprise you that I don't have all the answers. Or any, really. World leaders aren't letting up for my advice. Mutually assured destruction through nuclear annihilation was one of the biggest fears during the Cold War, and it hasn't really disappeared completely, even if all the sides who actually have the power to do so know that it should be avoided. Even the 1980s saw a de-escalation of nuclear tensions between the superpowers, with both sides slowing the arms race and making efforts to limit their nuclear arsenal. Even though the uncertainty and mistrust were there, it probably wasn't as out there and in your face as it was during the early days of the Cold War.
What we have just shown you exposes them for what they really are: lying, dirty, shrewd, godless, determined, and international criminal conspiracy.
Time makes things seem less obvious than they were. I'm not trying to romanticize it, really I'm not. Democracies around the world since the end of World War II have quadrupled, so the world agrees with me. But the tensions that the Cold War was built on didn't just disappear when it ended, they just changed what they looked like. Decolonization was another major process that I didn't cover here, as I hope to cover it in more detail in a later video, and its importance can often be swallowed up by considering the period as a single entity under the Cold War umbrella, when really it wasn't. Overall, the ideological dichotomy of capitalist versus communist that had dictated most of the foreign policy for the vast majority of the world for the past decades was broken, and made everyone reevaluate, well, everything. I haven't mentioned most of it because it's not my focus, but there was plenty going on. But still, increases in globalization, or making the world smaller through more economic, technological, and cultural interaction, didn't automatically bring us together. Far from it.
Don't say it. The writing's on the wall, along with the rest of it.
I think what I'm trying to say, through all this wordy garbage, is that the Cold War was a specific instance that allowed conflicts between ideologies and people to be magnified. But the fact is that its existence was just a framework that we gave to the period. Plenty of stuff went on since World War II that wasn't directly based on the Cold War, and its end didn't bring on the peace that people had hoped for. So nothing works out and nothing makes sense. Got it. I mean, not really, but look at everything that's happened since 1991, and at everything happening around us now. And it just seems like kind of a waste of time to base your entire worldview on a single, all-encompassing ideology, although a lot of people still do. The Cold War simplified the world, making it seem black and white, regardless of whatever side you were on, but its end didn't lead to the cohesion that both sides of the ideological dichotomy claimed it would. It just showed us how gray everything really is. Let's look at some of the major conflicts starting in the 90s. The Gulf War, the Bosnian War, the Rwandan Civil War, the Afghan Civil War, the Russian constitutional crisis of 1993, the Kosovo War, the Congo Wars, the Chechen Wars, wars. Keep in mind, these are only some of the inclusions on a very long list, with a bunch of them involving some of the former Soviet republics. And don't even get me started on the 21st century. Feel safer yet?
You are not here to ask.
Yeah, you get it. Turning the East and the West into completely uniform sides simplifies the world to an extreme, and one that avoids all the intricacies and interesting moments of the era. The end of the Cold War, something that dominated political discourse for decades, didn't bring the world together. In the end, its legacy showed us how splintered and separated we really are. I'm really a barrel of laughs and good cheer over here, huh? And all of this happened close to 3 decades after From Russia with Love was released. We know that Bond movies were produced for a Western audience, and had a distinctly pro-West message, aka Bond man good, foreign man bad, but do we really know if and how the other side saw them? The popularity of the Bond films would lead to a massive rise in spy genre movies in the West, ongoing to this day. And did the East have any sort of response to that? I mean, of course they did, because literally every single thing was a challenge back then. Ian Fleming's For Your Eyes Only was published in 1960 as his 8th Bond novel, but there was no movie by that name until 1981. However, there was an East German film, remember that's the Soviet-controlled part of Germany, the original title of which I won't try to say, but is translated as For Eyes Only, really close. It was released like 2 months before From Russia with Love, in August 1963. It involves a heroic East German double agent who's working to stop a US-led invasion of East Germany. See, everyone's the hero in their own story. Most of the time. Probably a better reaction than Bond, though. And to top it off, instead of ending that movie by tossing a sex tape into a canal, For Eyes Only actually ended with the hero really stressing family values by returning to his loving one. That's an interesting take from the Cold War quote-unquote bad guys.
This never happened to the other fella.
Is the world maybe a bit grayer than before? Another James Bond movie down, and another happy ending.
Horrible woman.
Yes, she's had her kicks.
No pun intended. Spy films are deeply rooted in the Cold War, because even if those types of movies existed before then, it was never as sexy as it was with the Bond films. Pretty obviously, James Bond wasn't particularly popular in the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. Places like Soviet-controlled East Germany wouldn't even show the movies at all, since his allegiance to the West is beyond question. So I didn't cover every major event in the Cold War, or any in detail really. The Cold War probably seems like a far-off memory at this point, and if not, it's really getting there. Decades have passed. Most of us can't really think about a time when nuclear annihilation was actually a daily worry. For a lot of people back then though, it really was a reality. I'm not saying that everyone was hiding under their desks at all times, even though that was a scientific and foolproof method against the atomic bomb, but the worry was there. And we know that we came close to the brink a few times. And those actually might have been more interesting to talk about now that I think about it. Like the Cuban Missile Crisis, a superpower standoff that took place like 10 days after Dark Knight was first released in theaters. Or the 1983 false alarm, where a single Soviet officer not overreacting might have saved the entire world. Even if I didn't cover it here, sometimes it really came down to a few people that kept the rest of us from ending it all. And I guess we still could. The option is there. But it feels kind of like the immediate threat is gone. Some days I don't even think about a deadly nuclear bomb attack at all.
We think that most of the time we will be warned before the bomb explodes. So there will be time for us to get into our homes, schools, or some other safe place. Some days I don't even think about a deadly nuclear bomb attack at all. We think that most of the time we will be warned before the bomb explodes. Some
days I don't even think about a deadly nuclear bomb attack at all.
Some other safe place.
I said over and over again that the United States and the Soviet Union were ideological opposites. But they had some commonalities that are kind of surprising. Mainly, the idea that both nations came about through violent revolutions. Although what self-respecting nation doesn't do that? I mean, come on. And that both considered their collective national experiences, based on completely separate ideologies, remember, could be copied and pasted onto the rest of the world. An idea that I borrowed from historian John Gaddis. And they both made a real go of it. Hell, you'd have to respect it if there weren't so many long-standing and ongoing consequences of their efforts to enlighten us all.
As if I didn't have enough problems.
So, I've basically covered an insignificant fraction of the Cold War, and I all but ignored communist movements outside the Soviet Union completely. But I think you can cut me some slack. There's no way to look at all of the social, cultural, political, economic, military, and technological aspects surrounding the Cold War in a single body of work, especially intercut with a movie. True, that was my choice, but you don't have to be so judgy about it.
For my next miracle,
Listen, I'm not perfect by any means.
Impossible. It was perfect.
So I'm obviously aware of my own biases, growing up in a Western nation. I also have the benefit of hindsight, so I'm basing a lot of my views on the outcome, not the thought processes of people trying to react to events as they actually took place. However, I think I've tried to be fair, which is really all I can do here. I mean, accurate would be nice too, but we can't have everything. But, and this shouldn't be a surprise at all, I don't think the world would be better off if the Soviet Union had been the quote-unquote winners of the Cold War. Their practices and efforts to remain in control were so brutal and unflinching for most of their history, and when they slackened their stranglehold a little bit, it all came crashing down around them. Look in the movie, look at this scene, where Kleb looks at Tatiana's file, and it tells her how many lovers that Tatiana has had. I have no clue if the Soviet Union actually kept tabs on people to such a degree, but it's not so out of the realm of possibility that I'm completely dismissing it as some sort of cinematic artistic license. I have doubt. It's there, based on what I do know about the USSR. McCarthyism was bad, sure, but it wasn't as bad as the Great Terror. And I don't remember a time when the US stuck its citizens on an island and just left them there, forcing them to resort to cannibalism. True story, by the way. A communist society was never technically reached either, but the pursuit of that goal is undermined by the people expected to build it not wanting to suffer their entire lives without seeing the fruits of their labor, or all the ones that were killed in the name of pursuing it. Also, if they had just hung around for 4 more days, then the Soviet Union would have existed for exactly 69 years. And now that would have been a lasting legacy. So I can definitely hold that against them. And listen, are capitalism and the US blameless through all this? No. There are problems with capitalism too, not the least of which is the giant wealth disparity between people and how power stems from that disparity. But if neither side is perfect, the better one won out.
Cold War's over. Well, finally those capitalist pigs will pay for their crimes, eh? Hey, comrades? Hey?
Austin, we won.
Oh, groovy, smashing. Yay, capitalism.
If we have to think about it in terms of winning and losing, which I have multiple times throughout this thing. That might get some of the ardent communists mad out there. It might redden their cheeks a bit more than they already were. But if the Soviet Union was your idea of a society worth fighting for, I think you might not grasp the degree to which a theory can change over time. So much so that it barely looks anything like it did when it started. And if you think that the ends justify the means, well, when the ends change, as they seem to over the course of the Soviet Union's existence, then those previously justifiable means need to change too. And they didn't. Basically, choose a better basis for your ideology. In the push for a classless, stateless, and moneyless world, the Soviet Union made some pretty terrible choices, to say the least. And as it usually is, it seems like regular people are the ones who suffered the worst of it. The whole society became some sort of vicious cycle, staying in power in order to stay in power. And when someone tried to change that mindset a bit, it broke down completely. At the same time, the lack of understanding concerning the Soviet Union and its history still goes on today. Look at all the people who ask, is this Soviet Russia? Every time anyone does something they don't agree with.
What is this, Soviet Russia? Right? Oh my god.
No, the existence of other beliefs in government or otherwise does not magically transform your society into a communist dictatorship. Seriously, get some perspective. Still, this is by no means a universal outlook. I have no doubt that some people remember the Soviet Union fondly, especially after the corrupt mess that followed. But it was a floundering nation on the downward trend by the 1980s, for sure. In the end though, both sides knew that the Cold War was counterproductive in terms of how they wanted to run their own countries. The clash was hindering them, but that shared knowledge didn't stop them at all. People will always find a way to let you down.
Red wine with fish. Well, that should have told me something.
But I've really gotten way too introspective and philosophical for my liking. Didn't I say this was going to be more real history than the last one? Good job there. And honestly, as I'm going through my script, James Bond kind of gets lost in all this. If looking at an individual author is too narrow, then looking at the entirety of the Cold War is way too broad. Honestly, I really need to find my groove at some point. At the same time, going back to From Russia with Love, the film is a major step up from its predecessor. It was even more of a success than Dr. No, despite the sequel going to production hell, dealing with problems like a budget that shrinks when you spend $150,000 on a single room, miscues on set, like setting off the explosives of the boat chase during a rehearsal, the literal near death of the director in a helicopter crash, and the leading lady in a car crash.
Sean Connery, following in another car, helps to pull his co-star out of the wreck.
But they did it anyway. Popping out a pretty damn good sequel only 1 year after the first one really helped to set up the James Bond films as a series, not only as a one-off spy quote-unquote thriller.
In front of them, the alabaster urn was brought from Bergamo, a famous historical city near Smyrna. Dates back from the Alexander...
There are also some really interesting moments behind the scenes. Like here, when Bond, Tatiana, and Karen Bay are escaping the Russian embassy. The director got a stuntman to hang off a balcony, off-screen, to help distract the crowds who came to watch and who were in the way of filming the entire time. Or the fact that during this scene, they didn't have a permit to film there at all, but they did it anyway. They even reversed some footage to help continuity issues, as well as moving scenes around to lay out the plot on a silver platter for the audience. Sure, I didn't like it that much, but who am I? What do I know? Overall, it really seemed like a tougher shoot than Dr. No by a considerable amount. And who was there to help out? Ian Fleming. Particularly interested in meeting Pedro Armendariz, which he actually did before Armendariz's death. But again, he wasn't overly involved in the making of the film itself, same as last time. Listen, in making this movie, they ramped up all the aspects from the last film a couple of notches, with more action and violence, more locations, more women, and less drawn-out walking sequences. No, not again. Sure, the story was kind of whatever, just a heist and a revenge plot. But if you look at it within the Cold War context that I tried to lay out, it really stands out in the franchise, existing in a world where the lack of an all-out hot war didn't mean a lack of conflict. JFK, you were right all along to put it on your list.
Nothing bad ever happens to the Kennedys!
Speaking of leaders like JFK, we often think that our presidents, prime ministers, general secretaries personify the values of our nation. And the Cold War let us think of international relations kind of like a boxing match or a chess match, any sort of match really, between these major figures, like JFK versus Khrushchev or Reagan versus Gorbachev.
It's showtime!
Of course, more people were affected, and we do try to avoid talking about great man history, even though I managed to do that a lot throughout this entire piece. But there is a wealth of information about larger historical trends beyond world leaders. Again, I didn't forget it, I just kind of ignored it, which I regret now that I'm at the end. But it's been a couple of hours already, we need to wrap this up at some point. Anyway, going back to world leaders, to make my hypocrisy complete, President John F. Kennedy was excited to see the movie version of From Russia with Love. Remember, the book version was one of his favorites. And even though there wasn't a wide-scale release in the US until the next year, he got to see it in a special White House screening before he had to fly off campaigning in Texas. That was on November 20th, 1963. Oh god. But, in terms of the movie, even if the producers or whoever didn't think that we as an audience would be smart enough to follow along, and they removed any sort of mystery or uncertainty from the plot completely,
But she's mental.
that doesn't take away from a pretty good movie overall, all the plot holes that I focused on aside. Really though, From Russia with Love showed that Bond could potentially carry an entire franchise, if they decided to keep it going. But why wouldn't they at this point? This one made even more money than the last one, and it really comes down to that, public consumption. Sure, it may be more serious than some of the ones that would follow. But is that a bad thing? I don't think so. There's an interesting realism to a lot of this movie that really makes it fun. Just like some of the more insane moments of the later films are also fun. But in a different way. In most of the Bond movies, there are particular things that stand out, even if it isn't the plot.
Vodka martini. Shaken or stirred? Do I look like I give a damn?
And this one is no exception. The story is nothing to write home about, but the execution was well done all around. I looked up a bunch of lists for the top Bond movies, and From Russia with Love was near the top for most of them. It even got its own video game adaptation in 2005, with Sean Connery voicing his character, as it should be. They made the changes you would expect for a video game, mainly pushing more action sequences instead of amazing dialogue exchanges like,
"Bring him to my office, will you?"
Take me to the lake.
"Through the training area."
But there was also another interesting change. Instead of Spectre as the bad guys, the video game introduces a stand-in that they called Octopus. Genius, because of the ring, they have their tentacles everywhere, I don't know. At that point, they still hadn't gotten the rights to the name Spectre. The Bond franchise and its legal issues, I swear. But we'll get to that. And, as popular as the movie was in the minds of critics and fans alike, most of the time, it was beaten out by another movie in terms of popularity, and that film was the one that really cemented Bond as a household name, action star hero, and cultural icon. I know, the tension must be killing you. Am I talking about Die Another Day? The Man with the Golden Gun? The 1967 version of Casino Royale that was a complete mess and just a parody of Bond and the spy genre? Here I go again with the leading questions.
You are not here to ask questions.
No, the number one on the vast majority of the list I saw was Goldfinger. And would you look at that, it just happens to be the next one that was released. In the following year, no less. If James Bond will return, then so will I. At least I'll try to. But comparing me to Bond just isn't fair. One is a cultural icon that transcends time and is beloved by millions around the world, while the other is just a character in a series of spy films. Go figure.
Knife. Boot. Knife. Boot. Knife. Boot. Knife boot.
Patent pending.
No, it's the right size. For me, that is.